Today I'm going to talk about how to progress at sampling. No matter what stage you're at, beginner, intermediate, or big brain, your sampling skills will progress after watching today's video. So I'm going to split this video into 3 different sections. I'm going to show how to progress as a beginner, how to get from beginner to intermediate, then how to get from intermediate to big brain. The last part will be difficult. For me, I had to learn how to change the size of my skull to make room for all the big brain sampling ideas. Watch this. Now we can make a tutorial on how to do this if enough of you hit the like button. So yeah, hit the like button. Also, leave a comment down below. Let me know if you also have the power to change the size of one of your bones. Alright, so let's start with how to progress as a beginner sampler. When a lot of newer producers start sampling, one of the common mistakes they make is focusing on the wrong sounds. Let me show you what I mean. Here I have this sample. I'm using Serato sample, by the way, but this holds true no matter what sampler you use. Now for a lot of newer beat makers, they might hear something like this Fender Rhodes melody, or some melodic sound in their sample, and they focus on that. This is what I used to do when I first started. I found some small piece of the sample that I really liked, and I would make my chops around that sound or riff that I liked. But the problem that you might run into is that no matter what you try, your chops just don't sound good together. Nothing really feels like it goes anywhere, and it ends up sounding like a series of random notes playing. And that's when you might fall into the trap of making tons of pointless chops to try and solve this problem, which I guarantee won't help. This is something that I talked about in an older sampling video of mine, the most common mistakes people make when sampling. Link to that is in the corner. So when you first start sampling, a better approach can be to focus on what's happening underneath that sound or riff that caught your attention. Often the problem is that those sounds aren't actually going anywhere. Even though you might have a lot of movement with the instrumentation that's on top, the instrumentation down below is stagnant. To really help you hear this, let me open up an EQ and really limit what's going on in those lower frequencies so you can hear those sounds underneath. It's pretty flat. We don't have any real progression. The loop that we built isn't really going anywhere. We can even see this visually. What I'm going to do is use Wave Candy. This is a stock FL plugin that lets you see the notes of your sounds and samples. Link to that video is also in the corner. This is a really powerful tool that I highly recommend using. So here you can see that even though our notes change in the high end, what's happening in the low end is just constant. And that is what might be causing all of your sampling issues. You're focusing on the wrong sounds to create chops around. To help with this problem, instead of focusing on that sound or riff and making chops around that, listen to what's happening underneath in the lower frequency sounds and create chops around those underneath sounds instead. So with these two chops, you can hear and see they have the exact same notes underneath, but these two chops here have different notes underneath. So using chops with different notes underneath can help me build an actual progression that feels like it's actually going somewhere. With this loop, we have an actual progression. It's very simple, but our sounds underneath actually provide some direction, and our loop actually has some feeling to it. And the great part is that I was able to still involve that one riff that I liked in this chop right here. So when you're sampling, it can help to focus on the right sounds in order to build an actual progression with your samples. As you do this, you'll start to notice your beats will actually have a direction rather than just sounding like a collage of random chops and sounds put together. Next, let's talk about how to move from beginner to intermediate sampling. In our first example, we relied on our sample to provide all the musical instrumentation for our beat. But as you get more comfortable with making beats, a way to progress is by using your sample as just another piece that accompanies your other instrumentation. Let's look at an actual example of this. Here we have this sample. This sample is far more minimal, but this can be a good thing. We don't always have to use our samples to fill up as much room as possible in our beat. Instead, we can use our sample as yet another layer, an interesting texture that we can build around. By having this approach, we gain a lot of flexibility. We can more easily build our own ideas instead of depending all on the sample. So here what I'm going to do is use these pieces from my sample. This is a very basic loop with far less happening compared to my last example. We don't have anything going on melodically, but this leaves the door open for me to come in and start building my own ideas using my own sounds. Since my loop was just so minimal and basic, creating a more melodic pattern around it using this sound became much easier. Now I can make a full beat out of this. Here is another example of this same sampling approach. I have yet another sample here. Just some plucked strings here, but what I'm going to do is reverse this sample in order to build this loop. Now what's great about using more minimal samples is it's just much easier to contort and manipulate them. If this was a huge sample with lots of layers, applying things like EQs and filters and even more creative effects might not work as well. They might actually end up ruining the sample. But here, since we have a very isolated sample, it allows me to do this. Here I use Shaperbox to play with the rhythm of my sample using a filter, and then I isolated some of the midtones using an EQ, and I added some color to the high end with some bit crushing. And again, what I can do now is introduce my own sounds. What I can do is come in and build my own progression that exists in those lower frequencies using my own sound. And since so much room is still available with how minimal my sample is, I can add even more sounds and layers. So this is the advantage of using more minimal samples once you get more comfortable with making beats and progressing more to an intermediate level. You can not only chop and rearrange your samples to create your own loops, but also build your own ideas around that sample that you've used. Now when it comes time to becoming a big brain sampler, it can help to completely rethink your samples and how you use them. Instead of using your samples as a sort of pre-built layer to build instrumentation around, you can use your samples as instruments themselves. Let me explain what I mean. Here I have this sample. Now what I can do is isolate just a single note from my sample. Then once you find just a single note, what you can do is use keyboard mode with your sampler, or you can isolate your note from your sample and use it in your beat. A full tutorial on how you can do this is in the corner. And now that I have my single note, I'm going to use this just like any other instrument and create a chord progression using this sound. This is such a powerful technique because it offers up the most flexibility in order to build your own ideas using a sample. And as you build your idea, you get the huge advantage of getting to use some really unique textures from your sample, which is one of the biggest advantages of using samples to begin with. another example of this exact same idea, but even more big-brained. Instead of taking one single note from my sample, I took this 2-note phrase instead. Then I pitched it way down, like 3 octaves, and built my own chord progression. You'll notice though that each note plays either both of these notes or just a single note, depending on how long I make each MIDI note in the piano roll. Fundamentally though, one thing that you might have noticed here is that to progress as a sampler, an approach can be to break your samples into smaller and smaller pieces when building your loop. This is something that I talked about in an older sampling video of mine where I cover 3 different approaches to sampling. This can really be a big help if you're new to sampling. I really recommend checking it out. The link to that video should be showing up right now, and I'll also leave a link to every other video that I mentioned in the description box below. Hopefully you've enjoyed this video. If so, like and subscribe. Head over to betterbeatmaker.com to check out my full online beatmaking course. The link to my free drum kit and my Discord community is also in the description box below. I'll see you guys next time.